blood, guts, and fire. This was not a battlefield. This was a sentence. August 1305. In the heart of London, thousands gathered like vultures drawn to death. The air reeked of sweat, smoke, and anticipation. Tied in chains, a man once hailed as the guardian of Scotland was dragged through the streets, not as a warrior, but as prey. His name was William Wallace, and today he would not just die, he would be destroyed. But this wasn't simply an execution, it was a message carved into flesh and echoed through centuries. Because the English didn't just want him gone, they wanted him erased, body, soul, and memory. So, why such cruelty? Why did England choose the most grotesque death in their arsenal? A ritual of horror known as being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Reserved only for traitors, monsters, and men who dared to defy the crown. To answer that, we must go back, to the beginning, to the birth of rebellion. They thought he was just a farmer's son. But fire sometimes begins in the smallest sparks. He was born not into royalty, not into power, but into oppression. William Wallace, likely born around 1270 in Elderslie or Ellerslie, Scotland, entered the world as the son of a minor landowner. A man without title, without political rank. But his name would one day thunder louder than any king's. Scotland at the time was a land caught in the claws of ambition. Its monarch had died without an heir. And into the void stepped England. King Edward I, known to history as Longshanks, a warlord cloaked in royalty. He didn't just want influence over Scotland. He wanted dominion. To many nobles, this was a chance for compromise, for survival, but not for Wallace. He wasn't molded by courtly manners or diplomacy. He was molded by loss. Some say his father was killed by English forces, others that he witnessed the execution of his brothers. Whatever the truth, something inside him fractured. And from that fracture, a flame began to burn. He did not seek the war, but the war found him. The tipping point came not on the battlefield, but in a small village. Wallace, accused of killing an English soldier, was declared an outlaw, branded, hunted. In most stories, this is where the man flees, hides, waits for mercy. Wallace chose war. He didn't raise banners. He didn't call noble allies. He took up axe and fire and began striking back, village by village, outpost by outpost. And from the shadows, others joined him. Farmers, blacksmiths, peasants with nothing left to lose. They didn't follow him because he was powerful. They followed him because he wasn't. He was them. And together, they became a storm. The English called him a criminal. The Scots called him hope. What terrified the English crown most was not Wallace's skill in battle, but his ability to ignite belief. He spoke not of negotiation, but freedom. Not of survival, but sovereignty. To some nobles, he was dangerous. To Edward I, he was a threat that had to be crushed, not just defeated, but annihilated. In 1297, Wallace led a force to the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and what happened stunned all of Europe. Against overwhelming odds, the Scots massacred the English army. It was not just a military victory, it was a humiliation. A peasant had bested the greatest empire in the West. A man with no bloodline had struck down knights in armor. And so, Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland. But power is a double-edged sword. Rebellion creates heroes. but politics creates corpses. Within months, noble factions turned on him. Some envied his fame, others feared Edward's wrath. And Wallace? He refused to bow. He wouldn't kneel to the English. He wouldn't compromise with the Scottish nobles who wanted peace at the price of chains. So they isolated him. His army thinned, his resources dried up. The Guardian became a ghost. By 1305, he was betrayed, captured near Glasgow by a fellow Scotsman, Sir John de Menteith, dragged in chains to London, not as a prisoner of war, but as a traitor to the crown, a label he never accepted. Because to be a traitor, one must first be a subject. Wallace never recognized Edward as his king. He was not a subject. He was a Scot. His trial would be a mockery. His death, something far worse. London would not give him justice. They wanted a lesson, a spectacle, a warning carved into skin and history. But before that, they would place him on trial. They would strip him of his humanity in front of a jeering crowd. And then they would unleash the cruelest punishment ever devised by English law. But that is a story for the next chapter. He was supposed to be nothing. But at Stirling, nothing became a legend. September 11th, 1297. Dawn rose over the River Forth, and with it, the sound of English war drums, beating like the heart of an empire ready to crush rebellion. Thousands of English troops, well-armored and confident, prepared to cross Stirling Bridge, a narrow choke point the Scots had seemingly failed to destroy. They believed this would be a swift massacre. After all, they faced a rabble, peasants with pitchforks, led by an outlaw with no noble blood. No cavalry, no siege weapons, no royal backing. They did not realize they were marching into a trap carved in steel and blood. Wallace had nothing, and so he had nothing to lose. Wallace, along with Andrew Moray, had studied the terrain. They knew Stirling Bridge could not accommodate more than 2 or 3 men riding abreast. They knew the English would be overconfident. And they knew the moment would come, when the first half of the army had crossed, and the other half remained stranded behind. That was when they struck. From the high ground, Scottish forces descended like wolves. Swords howled through the fog. English soldiers trapped on the bridge were cut down, their bodies falling into the water below. Panic spread like fire. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. England expected surrender. Instead, they received vengeance. The victory at Stirling Bridge was more than strategic. It was psychological warfare. In a single morning, William Wallace went from fugitive to national hero. The news raced through Scotland like wildfire. Villages sang his name. Young men left their homes to join him. Even some Scottish nobles, once skeptical, were forced to recognize that this peasant general had done the impossible. The English, meanwhile, were stunned. Stirling wasn't just a military loss. It was an embarrassment, a humiliation that struck at the heart of Edward's imperial pride. And Wallace? He didn't stop. He did not build castles. He burned them. After Stirling, Wallace took the fight deep into English territory. He didn't just defend Scotland. He invaded northern England. Towns like Berwick and Northumberland were set ablaze, crops destroyed, garrisons slaughtered. To the English, Wallace became a demon of war, a name whispered by terrified mothers to frighten children into obedience. But his tactics weren't just cruelty. They were a message. This is what conquest feels like. What Edward had done to Scotland, Wallace returned in kind, steel for steel, flame for flame. But war burns more than cities. It burns alliances. Not all Scots supported Wallace. Many nobles, especially those with land and ties in England, feared the long-term consequences of total war. Wallace's brutality, though effective, made him enemies on both sides of the border. When Andrew Moray died from wounds sustained at Stirling, Wallace lost not just a friend, but a political bridge, a noble ally who had legitimized his leadership. Now Wallace stood alone at the top, surrounded by blades, some in English scabbards, others behind Scottish smiles. Even so, in 1298, he was officially named Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. But his next battle would not be in his favor. At Falkirk, the fire met iron. In July 1298, Edward I himself led an enormous English army north. This was no longer a war of governors. This was personal. The Battle of Falkirk saw Wallace's forces overwhelmed by England's superior cavalry and longbowmen. His tactics, brilliant at Stirling, could not withstand the sheer force and coordination of Edward's vengeance. Wallace survived, but resigned his position as guardian. His fall, however, was not the end of his legend. In defeat, Wallace became something more dangerous than a general. He became a martyr in waiting. Legends are born in fire, but they are tempered in betrayal. For the next several years, Wallace remained in the shadows. Rumors followed him. He had traveled to France seeking aid, or had become a ghost warrior, striking English supply lines at night. The truth was less romantic, but more tragic. Wallace was isolated, hunted, betrayed by his own kind, captured not by English steel, but by Scottish treachery. In 1305, near Glasgow, he was seized by Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight acting under English orders. The man Scotland once called Saviour was chained and dragged south like a trophy of conquest. But Edward didn't want a prisoner. He wanted a warning, and London was ready. Stirling was not just a victory. It was a crime Edward would never forgive. Wallace had humiliated the English war machine. He had shown the world that a peasant could break an empire's spine. Edward's vengeance would not be swift. It would be methodical, theatrical, and merciless. Wallace would not be executed. He would be unmade. Glory makes you untouchable, until it makes you alone. The fire that Wallace had ignited at Stirling was beginning to flicker. It wasn't the English who first weakened him. It was the Scots. The very nobles he fought for began to fear him, not for his violence, but for what he represented. He was a man outside the system, a figure of the people, a sword against compromise. And that made him dangerous in a world built on fragile alliances and noble deals. His refusal to kneel to either Edward or the aristocracy isolated him. He refused to be tamed, so they left him to the wolves. After the defeat at Falkirk in 1298, Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland. His defeat wasn't just military, it was political. Nobles who had once supported him now distanced themselves, turning instead to Robert the Bruce or John Comyn, both contenders for the Scottish throne. Wallace had no title, no land, and now no army. But Edward I hadn't forgotten. He knew Wallace alive meant rebellion could still rise again. So the hunt began. He became a shadow, a whisper in the woods. But kings fear whispers too. For years, Wallace vanished from the spotlight. Some accounts claim he traveled to France, seeking aid from King Philip IV. Others say he may have journeyed to Rome, appealing to the Pope for support. But records are scarce, and like all legends, the truth is blurred by myth. What is certain is that Wallace never surrendered. Even as Scotland's political scene twisted and fractured, he remained a loyalist to the idea of an independent Scotland. Loyal to the deposed King John Balliol, refusing to accept English rule or negotiate with Edward. But ideals alone do not build armies. And in the shadows, eyes were watching. Every legend has its Judas. In August 1305, near Glasgow, Wallace was captured. Not by English knights, but by Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish noble loyal to Edward I. Some say Menteith did it for a reward. Others claim he saw Wallace as a threat to the fragile peace. Either way, betrayal is betrayal. Wallace was seized, shackled in iron, and transported under heavy guard. The man who once led thousands to victory was now dragged like cattle across the border. And Edward had no intention of a quiet execution. He would parade the traitor through London, a trophy of England's triumph. He was not tried. He was displayed. In London, the streets pulsed with anticipation. Posters branded Wallace a murderer, a traitor, a monster. But he was not given legal representation. He was not allowed to defend himself. Instead, he was mocked, dressed in a crown of oak leaves, as if he were some false king of outlaws. The crowd laughed, jeered, spit. Yet Wallace said one thing that silenced them all. I never swore allegiance to Edward. How can I be a traitor to a king I never acknowledged? It was not a plea. It was a final declaration. Kings demand obedience. Wallace offered defiance. To Edward, that made him more than a criminal. It made him a symbol. And symbols are dangerous, so the king ordered a sentence that would erase the symbol from the flesh. A death so horrifying it would echo through generations. It would be public. It would be painful. It would be ritualized cruelty. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. A punishment not designed to kill quickly, but to break, to humiliate, and to destroy, inch by inch. His final march was not to the gallows, but into legend. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was tied to a wooden panel and dragged through the streets of London by horses. Miles of dirt, stone, and filth scraping his skin raw. He was brought to Smithfield, the execution ground. There, in front of thousands, the final act of vengeance began. But Wallace said nothing. No cry, no plea, just silence. Even in chains, he denied them fear. But the execution, that horror, we must save for another night. Because what happened next, the ritual of hanging, evisceration, and quartering, is one of the most infamous punishments in history. But it wasn't about Wallace alone. It was about power, fear, and a king trying to kill an idea. In the next chapter, we will open the black book of English justice and look into the pit of hanged, drawn, and quartered. Not as myth, but as historical, medical, and political reality. And then you will understand why England chose the cruelest death in medieval England, was never just punishment. It was theater, a lesson carved in screaming flesh. August 23rd, 1305, Smithfield, London. They brought him through the city, not as a man, but as a warning. Tied to a wooden hurdle, William Wallace was dragged for miles, his back scraping against the cobblestones, bones cracking against earth and stone, the crowd spitting, cheering, hurling refuse. But the king wasn't watching for pleasure. He was watching for silence. To see the fear born in the hearts of those who might follow Wallace. Because what came next wasn't death. It was transformation. Turning a man into a symbol of terror. Hanged, drawn, quartered. 3 words, 1,000 screams. Let's break it down. This form of execution, reserved exclusively for traitors to the English crown, was codified not only to punish, but to dehumanize, dismember, and destroy every part of one's body, image, and memory. Its steps were exact, choreographed like a grotesque ritual. 1. Dragged, drawn to the execution site behind a horse, tied face up. 2. Hanged until nearly dead, not to kill, but to weaken. 3. Eviscerated while still alive, stomach slit open, intestines pulled out before the crowd. 4. Genitals cut off, symbolizing the traitor's bloodline being erased. 5. Organs burned before the victim's eyes. 6. Finally, beheaded and quartered, limbs cut and sent across the kingdom. This wasn't justice. It was annihilation. When Wallace reached Smithfield, his body was already battered and bloodied. But they strung him up, noose tight, but not fatal. His body twisted, legs kicked, gasping for air. And then, as the world dimmed, they cut him down. No reprieve. Only the next act. They laid him on a table. With surgical cruelty, the executioner cut open his abdomen. No anesthetic, no mercy. His intestines, steaming and slick, were pulled out, inches at a time. Still conscious, still breathing. Then came the fire. His entrails and genitals were thrown into the flames, the smell of burning flesh mixing with incense from the cathedral nearby, a mockery of sanctity. What kind of mind invents this? To understand this ritual, we must look at its political psychology. In medieval England, treason was not merely rebellion. It was blasphemy against the state, against God's appointed king. Therefore, the punishment had to mirror the depth of that betrayal. Dragging. Humiliation, stripping of dignity. Partial hanging, suffering but denying a swift death. Evisceration, a symbolic destruction of internal will. Castration, ending the bloodline of the traitor. Quartering, division of the body as a warning across all regions. Wallace's limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, each a scar of his rebellion. His head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike atop London Bridge, a permanent snarl of silence aimed at any Scot who dared dream of freedom. Science calls it exsanguination. History calls it horror. From a modern medical perspective, Wallace likely died from a combination of blood loss, exsanguination during evisceration, shock from pain and trauma, hypoxia during partial hanging, organ failure. But here's what makes this worse. He was kept alive as long as possible, not for mercy, but so he could see, so he could feel, so he could know. He never cried for mercy. He only cried, freedom. Accounts vary. Some say Wallace shouted nothing. Others say his final word before the axe fell was freedom. But whether whispered or imagined, that word, freedom, would be his legacy. Because Edward failed. He killed the man. But he created a martyr. Why such cruelty? Because fear is the strongest crown. Edward, I wasn't just punishing Wallace. He was sending a message to every Scot, every Welshman, every Irish rebel, and even every English subject. This is what happens when you defy me. And for a while, it worked. No great rebellion followed Wallace's death. The nobles retreated into politics. Scotland fell quiet. But seeds don't sprout in fire. They sprout in ashes. And in those ashes, others would rise. Wallace died in parts, but his story remains whole. No bones were buried. No tomb received him. His body was scattered, but his name would be stitched back together by memory, by story, by defiance. Today, a statue stands tall in Stirling, not because Wallace was flawless, but because he refused to kneel. Even when his body was torn apart, his will remained unbroken. A tyrant never kills the man. He kills what the man represents. In the annals of English history, no execution was more theatrical, more grotesque, or more calculated than that of William Wallace. It wasn't done in the dark. It wasn't swift. It was public, prolonged, and deeply symbolic. But why? Why not simply behead him, or hang him as with other criminals? Why did Edward Wallace, King of England, conqueror of Wales, and self-declared ruler of Scotland, choose this ancient, sadistic, and almost religious ritual of destruction? Because Wallace was never just a man. He was an idea. Treason was not a crime. It was a theological heresy. To understand Edward's decision, we must step into medieval political theology. In 1305, kings were not merely rulers. They were believed to be anointed by God. To rebel against the king was not just to disobey law, it was to blaspheme. The punishment had to reflect this cosmic scale of betrayal. And so, hanged, drawn, and quartered became not just justice, but sacrifice. Every phase of the punishment mirrored a symbolic undoing of the man's soul. Dragging equals stripping the rebel from society. Partial hanging, delaying death, denying escape. Evisceration is removing the inner truth. Castration is cutting off legacy. Quartering is dispersing him into oblivion. It was the unmaking of a myth, performed like a ritual exorcism. Edward was not afraid of Wallace. He was afraid of memory. Wallace had done what no Scot before him dared. Defied the king without noble blood, without foreign aid, without permission. And worst of all, he won. Stirling Bridge was not just a military embarrassment. It was a shattering of divine right. Edward could not let Wallace die a soldier's death. That would make him a martyr too soon. He needed to be displayed. He needed to be humiliated. He needed to be forgotten through horror. But horror rarely erases. It imprints. By making Wallace's death public and explicit, Edward hoped to achieve 3 goals. 1. Suppress rebellion. By showing what happened to traitors, he hoped to silence would-be rebels across Britain. 2. Reclaim divine authority. By punishing Wallace as a heretic, Edward reinforced the image of the crown as sacred and unquestionable. 3. Discredit Wallace's legend. By dragging his body, dismembering it, and scattering it, he sought to break the myth before it could spread. But Edward underestimated one thing. Pain does not erase memory. It engraves it deeper. Power wants obedience, but it fears meaning. In Edward's court, law was not just about order, it was about control of the narrative. Wallace had created a story that threatened that control, a story where a commoner could challenge a king, where identity could triumph over submission, where Scotland could exist without English rule. That story had to die, not by the sword, but by disgrace. That's why they burned his entrails, why they tarred his head and stuck it above London Bridge, why his limbs were nailed to city gates hundreds of miles apart. It was not vengeance, it was message. Don't remember him as a hero, remember him as meat. But the mind remembers what it fears. The more grotesque the punishment, the more unforgettable it becomes. Children who witnessed the execution grew up haunted. Towns that displayed Wallace's limbs never forgot the stench, the flies, the silence. And while Edward believed he had erased Wallace from history, he had immortalized him, not as a general, but as a symbol. Because every limb nailed to a gate was a silent scream. You can kill a man, you can burn his flesh, but can you kill what he stood for? The price of tyranny is paranoia. Edward's obsession with control led him to overreach. Instead of discouraging rebellion, Wallace's death made him a legend. And legends spread, whispered from fire to fire, tavern to tavern. The English crown, once feared, became a symbol of cruelty. And Scotland, though quiet for a time, would boil again. Because cruelty does not breed loyalty. It breeds resistance in silence. So why did Edward choose the cruelest death? Because he believed terror was eternal. Because he thought fear would outlive freedom. But in chasing that illusion, he ensured one thing. Wallace's name would outlast his crown. He died screaming. But Scotland answered in silence. 1305. William Wallace is dead. His body has been torn apart, his name dragged through the mud, and his remains pinned like trophies to the corners of the kingdom. In London, King Edward smiles. He believes the rebellion has been broken, that the Scots, like their fallen champion, have been dismantled piece by piece. But in the highlands and glens of Scotland, a different silence settles. Not peace, not surrender, but a quiet, burning shame. When you kill a man that brutally, you don't bury him, you plant him. Wallace's death was meant to send a message. Your hero is gone. Your hope has ended. Submit. But the reaction across Scotland wasn't immediate war. It wasn't heroic songs. It was fear. Villages that had once fed his soldiers now fell quiet. Nobles who once whispered resistance now kept their heads down. Wallace had proven that courage could inspire nations. But Edward had shown that defiance came with a price few were willing to pay. And for a time, Scotland froze. But fire doesn't die, it smolders. Though the public rose no banners, in secret the legend grew. Children asked their parents why the English feared Wallace so deeply. Elders whispered of Stirling Bridge and the night raids. And monks, quietly, began to record his story, not as a traitor, but as a martyr. The church did not openly rebel, but it remembered. The people did not march, but they waited. They waited for someone, not just to fight, but to unite. And somewhere in the shadows, a man was watching. Robert the Bruce. The nobles had abandoned Wallace, but Wallace had changed them anyway. At the time of Wallace's execution, the Scottish nobility was fractured. Two main factions vied for the throne. The Commons, politically cautious, leaning toward compromise with England. The Bruces, ambitious, torn between loyalty and self-interest. Robert the Bruce, grandson of a claimant to the Scottish crown, had a choice: pledge loyalty to Edward I and gain security, or gamble everything and finish what Wallace started. Wallace's execution, its brutality, its publicness, its humiliation, was a turning point. It showed Bruce that negotiation would never bring true independence. Only fire could answer fire. In the stillness after Wallace's death, the next rebellion began breathing. The years immediately following 1305 were eerily quiet. No major uprisings, no great battles. Edward thought the Scots were broken. But beneath that calm, a movement began to crystallize. In 1306, just months after Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce would make his move. He killed his rival, John Comyn, at the altar of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. It was not just murder. It was a declaration. There is no room for peace, only war. Bruce had understood what Wallace died for. Now he would fight for the Scotland Wallace imagined, but with a crown on his head. Wallace's death taught Scotland something. Pain passes, but humiliation doesn't. The silence after Wallace's execution was not forgetfulness. It was mourning, deep, bitter, and pregnant with purpose. Even those who had doubted him now saw clearly. That England did not want cooperation. It wanted submission. That Wallace had not been reckless. He had been right. That freedom, once tasted, could never be forgotten. The execution designed to kill rebellion had, ironically, clarified its necessity. From that silence would rise a war unlike any before. The wars of Scottish independence entered a new phase. It was no longer just scattered uprisings or symbolic raids. It became a national identity forged in trauma. By the time of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce had taken the torch Wallace left behind and set the battlefield ablaze. And though Wallace's sword never swung at Bannockburn, his presence loomed over every blow. He died in pieces, but the nation began coming back together. Wallace's limbs, nailed across the kingdom, were meant to divide, but they did the opposite. In Stirling, they remembered his victory. In Perth, they whispered of his defiance. In Berwick, they mourned his betrayal. And in London, where his head rotted above the bridge, travelers stared upward and wondered, what kind of power kills with such hatred and still fears the corpse? The English tried to silence him. Instead, they made him a story. And stories are the most dangerous weapons of all, because they do not rot, they do not bleed, they travel from lips to ears, from songs to swords. And Scotland, though shaken, had not forgotten. The silence wasn't the end. It was the inhale before the roar. Wallace was the spark. Bruce would be the firestorm. In the cold silence left behind by William Wallace's execution, Scotland waited. Not for a savior, not for a martyr, but for a strategist, a man who could wear a crown with one hand and wield a sword with the other. That man was Robert the Bruce. But Bruce was not Wallace. He didn't rise from the fields. He wasn't a man of the people. He was a nobleman, educated, ambitious, calculating. And yet, by the end of his journey, he would do what Wallace never could: unite a broken country and defeat an empire. He watched Wallace burn and saw the price of waiting. Robert the Bruce's early role in the wars of Scottish independence was ambiguous. He had, at times, fought against the English, but also compromised with them. He signed oaths of loyalty to Edward I. He feuded with other Scottish nobles, particularly John Comyn, another claimant to the Scottish throne. While Wallace bled in the mud for Scotland's freedom, Bruce played the long game. Some saw this as cowardice, others as wisdom. But Wallace's death changed everything. It showed Bruce that appeasement would never lead to peace, only to degradation, chains, and slow national death. So he chose fire. In February 1306, Bruce met Comyn at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, a holy place where weapons were forbidden. But politics has no sanctuary. They argued. Blades were drawn. And there, at the altar, Bruce killed Comyn, his greatest rival. It was sacrilege. It was murder. And it was the beginning. Just weeks later, Bruce crowned himself King of Scots at Scone. He was now an outlaw, a king without a kingdom. But Scotland had a leader again. But kings bleed too. Bruce's first year as king was disastrous. Edward III, enraged by the killing of Comyn, sent a brutal force into Scotland. Bruce's family was hunted. His brothers were captured and executed gruesomely. His sisters were imprisoned in cages, hung from English castles as human trophies. And Bruce himself? He fled into the wilderness, hunted, hiding in caves, reduced to the life of an animal. It was here, in isolation, that legend says Bruce watched a spider try again and again to spin a web across a rock, failing, rebuilding, until it succeeded. And Bruce, like the spider, chose not to give up. He returned, not as a nobleman, but as a guerrilla. From 1307 onward, Bruce led a brutal, mobile, and unrelenting campaign of resistance. No longer relying on castles or formal armies, he adopted the methods Wallace had used: ambushes, hit-and-run raids, sabotage. He burned fortresses rather than defend them, denying them to the English. He didn't fight for noble approval. He fought for control of the land, and slowly he took it back. Town by town, river by river, until the Lion of England began to retreat. Edward I died chasing him. Edward II would die fearing him. In 1307, Edward I died en route to crush Bruce, his body failing just as his iron will still pushed forward. His son, Edward II, inherited the war. But he lacked his father's cruelty and his brilliance. Bruce took advantage. He expanded his power, forged alliances, reclaimed castles once thought lost. And in 1314, it came to a head. Bannockburn, where ghosts found justice. The Battle of Bannockburn was not just a military engagement. It was the spiritual vindication of Wallace 8 years after his execution. Bruce led a Scottish force, smaller, less equipped, against a massive English army. But he chose the terrain. He baited their pride, He turned the battlefield into a graveyard of empire. By the end of the day, Edward II had fled, and Bruce had secured more than victory. He had secured freedom. Wallace died without a crown. Bruce lived to wear one because of Wallace. Though their paths were different, one forged in fire, one in shadow, Bruce owed his rise to Wallace's fall. Wallace taught Scotland what submission looked like. Bruce taught them how to win, but both were part of the same war. Wallace lit the match. Bruce brought the flame to the gates of England. History remembers the victory, but never forgets who bled first. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath, a letter to the Pope, was drafted by Scottish nobles declaring their independence. It read, "For as long as 100 of us remain alive, we shall never submit to English rule. For it is not glory, nor riches, nor honors we fight for, but freedom alone." Those words were Wallace's spirit, written with Bruce's pen. And in 1328, the English crown, broken and weary, recognized Scotland's independence. The rebel and the king, two sides of one war. Wallace and Bruce were never allies, but they were never enemies. One gave Scotland a reason to rise. The other gave it the means to survive. And together, across fire and steel, they carved a nation from the grip of an empire. They scattered his body, but they could not scatter his name. August 1305. William Wallace died screaming. Burned, butchered, broken. No funeral, no grave, no tombstone. The English believed that they had erased him, piece by piece. But what they didn't understand was this: you can cut down the man, but you cannot cut down the meaning. And Wallace was never just a man. He was the embodiment of defiance, of a people who refused to kneel, of a nation that would rather burn than bow. History often forgets the losers. Wallace made sure it couldn't. The 14th century passed. So did the wars. Scotland gained and lost independence, fought new battles, crowned new kings. But through it all, the myth of Wallace endured. In monasteries, monks copied tales of his bravery. Minstrels sang of his battles by firelight. Children played games pretending to be Wallace the Brave. He became larger than life, a warrior, a martyr, a spirit. Some stories claimed he was 7 feet tall, that he could fight 10 men at once, that he rode a ghost horse through mists at night. It didn't matter if it was true, because truth fades, but symbols stay. The English made him a traitor. The Scots made him a saint. For centuries, Wallace remained controversial in England, dismissed as a barbarian, a killer, an outlaw. But in Scotland, he became sacred. He was not seen as perfect. He was seen as necessary. Not a politician, not a noble, but a voice for the voiceless, the poor, the beaten, the forgotten. Saw in Wallace a man who stood when standing meant death. And that courage became a mirror for national identity. When Scotland forgot who it was, Wallace reminded them. In the centuries that followed, especially during times of oppression, occupation, or political doubt, Wallace's name surged back into memory. During the Jacobite rebellions, during English-imposed laws, even during world wars, when Scots questioned who they were fighting for. Statues were erected, poems were written. Books carried his tale across continents. One of the most famous was The Acts and Deeds of Sir William Wallace, written in the 15th century by Blind Harry. A semi-mythical biography that transformed Wallace from rebel into legend. And then came the silver screen. In 1995, Wallace returned not in chains, but in celluloid. The film Braveheart, directed by and starring Mel Gibson, reintroduced the story of Wallace to a global audience. Though riddled with historical inaccuracies, the movie captured something essential: the fire in his eyes, the refusal to kneel, the famous last scream, freedom. Millions who had never heard the name before now spoke it. Scotland's struggle became known worldwide, and Wallace became a household name across oceans. But his real legacy was never in Hollywood. It was in hearts. The true power of Wallace isn't in the dramatizations. It's in the idea that one man, without title or army, could shake a throne. It's the belief that even if you lose the war, dying for what's right has value. That sometimes the only answer to tyranny is to stand and burn. Every country has a Wallace, but few dare to follow him. Wallace's story is not just Scottish. It belongs to every people who have lived under occupation, oppression, or injustice. He is what fear looks like from the other side, to rulers who think might makes right. And in every whisper of rebellion, in every clenched fist, in every refusal to bow, Wallace breathes again. His sword rusted. His name did not. In the city of Stirling today, a monument towers over the landscape, the Wallace Monument. Inside, his sword is displayed, 5 feet of iron. Heavy, brutal, real. Thousands visit each year, not to mourn, but to remember, to look into history's eyes and say, "You tried to erase him, but now he stands taller than ever." Freedom is not given, it's earned, in blood, in fire, and in silence. In every generation, the word returns. Freedom, a simple word, one that rolls off the tongue, and yet costs more than most are willing to pay. William Wallace knew that cost. He didn't read about it in books. He bled it into the earth, felt it in the crack of the whip, in the pull of the news, somebody in the fire that consumed his insides. And yet, his last breath was not a plea. It was a word. Freedom. But what does that word truly mean? Is it the absence of chains, or the presence of dignity? Wallace never lived to see Scotland free. He died branded a traitor, alone, butchered by those who feared his spirit more than his sword. And yet, centuries later, he stands higher than the kings who killed him. Why? Because freedom is not measured in victory. It is measured in the refusal to accept defeat of the soul. Wallace's freedom was not political. It was personal. He chose death over obedience to a crown he did not recognize. He chose truth over comfort, defiance over survival, and in that, he became free in the purest sense. Freedom, when real, always comes with pain. No tyrant gives it. No document secures it forever. No flag guarantees it. It must be earned and re-earned through generations who understand what it costs. And that cost is often loneliness, sacrifice, misunderstanding, and sometimes death. Wallace died not surrounded by friends, not honored by his countrymen. He died torn to pieces, but his soul was untouched. Every era has its chains. They just change shape. In Wallace's time, it was the sword and crown. Today, it may be fear of speaking the truth, living a life others designed for you, being told what to think, who to be, how to feel. Tu du, cum lundentu bauluk. Matu suluachan kandam, ki mai tu bauta nen kuido. Wallace's legacy isn't about hating enemies. It's about loving the idea of being fully, unapologetically alive and refusing to kneel, even when alone. The price of freedom is high, but the price of forgetting it is higher. Countries can be conquered. Souls, however, must be surrendered. Wallace proved that a single man, armed only with conviction, could make an empire tremble. And that's why he was executed the way he was. Not just to kill him, but to terrify memory itself. It didn't work. Because across time, across language, across oceans, his name still burns. So what is the promise of freedom? That one day someone will hear your story and rise. That one act of courage can become a beacon for centuries. That pain, when chosen with dignity, transforms into power. Freedom's promise is not that we will always win. It is that we will always resist. And in resistance, we become more than flesh. We become meaning. Wallace is dead, but we are his voice now. Every time you say, "I will not comply with what I do not believe. I choose truth even if it costs me." I remember those who stood when it was hardest to do so. You carry his flame, and in doing so, you keep the promise. So what does freedom mean? It means you are willing to be torn apart, so your children will never have to. It means you do not wait for permission to be fully human. It means that even as the noose tightens, you can look your enemy in the eyes and say, "You may kill me, but you'll never own me." That is what freedom means. That is what William Wallace died for. William Wallace was not invincible. He failed. He was betrayed. He died in agony. But in choosing not to kneel, even in his final breath, he transformed from a man into an eternal symbol of freedom. His story taught me this. Freedom doesn't begin with victory. It begins the moment you say no to what you know is wrong. Even if the price is pain, loneliness, or being misunderstood by the world, holding on to your dignity in your darkest hour is the truest form of triumph. Today, we may not face tyrants with swords or crowns, but the chains still exist, in silence, in fear, in the pressure to conform, and that's why Wallace's legacy still matters.